Are you afraid of using the higher ISO settings on your camera? It's a pretty common thing that I hear in a lot of the classes that I teach when I talk about having to increase the ISO in order to get a certain shutter speed or for light conditions. As someone who shoots a lot of nature and travel photography, along with some astrophotography, high ISO is just a fact of life. It's just something that you have to deal with. And over the years, I've discovered that there are several things that we can do to improve the initial image that we're capturing, but then also to deal with the noise if we do have any in our photo afterwards. So what is digital noise? So if we look at this photo, this is a really good example of what digital noise looks like. It's that graininess that happens in a photo that typically is underexposed at a high ISO setting, or one that maybe some of our import settings could have been a little bit different, which also could have helped mitigate some of this problem. Let's take a look at some photos that were shot at high ISO, number of different types of exposures. We're going to import some samples, and we're going to just be using the default that Lightroom has, which means every photo that comes in is going to be interpreted using the profile of Adobe Standard. I have 3 photos that were taken by me. One, a friend of mine that shoots Canon. Since my photos are all taken on Nikon equipment, I wanted to have something showing a different manufacturer and to see if there's any differences there as well, or if the same process still works. So my friend Rick was nice enough to send me a few photos. I thought this one of the otters would be pretty good. As we look at these photos, first thing you notice is this first one is really, really dark. And when we look at the histogram, it's interesting to notice that there is some brightness that gets maybe 2/3 across, but it's really way underexposed. And this was a big part of the problem as to why we had so much noise. And if we just come in and look at that, and I just bring up the exposure to somewhere probably right around there. So I do have now the line going all the way across. I do have a little bit of information on the right, which would be the stars, maybe some of this glow of these buildings in the background. But now if I zoom in, I can see it really is a mess when it comes to noise. So it was almost 3 stops underexposed for where it should have been, and that is always going to just give you a lot of noise. In fact, even with low ISOs, you're still going to probably see that kind of behavior. But I want to look at some of these other photos as well. So here's another example of a underexposed photo, and notice there's quite a bit of noise in this one when we're looking at it at 100%. And now we're going to take a look at this photo, and this one was shot brighter. And so even though it's at ISO 8000, it is relatively clean, and it is something that you would be able to deal with through post-processing pretty easily. And now let's take a look at the Canon one as well. And we can see the noise isn't too bad. This is at 12,800, so even higher. But when we look at the otter itself, we do see some grain in there. But overall, I would say, this looks pretty good. Very well thought out photo in terms of exposure and also interest. I love the fish there. So well, shout out to Rick for really doing a nice job capturing this image. So I'm going to now make a change, and that is on a Mac. If you go to the Lightroom Classic menu, you'll find preferences. If you're on a Windows machine, it's actually under the edit menu. And if I go there, there's a checkbox, and where it says override global settings for specific cameras, I can go ahead and check that. And now I can select the camera. Now there is a little bit of a chicken and egg thing that happens here. The camera won't show up unless you've already imported photos from that camera on this list within this specific catalog. However, if you have other catalogs that you've created earlier and you do have some of these set up, they will still show up. You just have to re-enable them. In the case of the Nikon D850, you can see I don't have that over here. So I purposely left that one off of here just to show you the process to go and create the default to use the camera settings. And so select Nikon D850, and then under this default, we go and select camera settings. Now what this is going to do is it's going to tell Lightroom when you import a photo, if the camera, which is in the data that's contained within the photo, the EXIF data, if that indicates it's a Nikon D850, then I want you to use camera settings. But we're not finished yet. And this is where sometimes those of us who use Macs sometimes run into a little bit of a issue. We forget to do the last step, because a lot of times on Macs, when you're working in dialog boxes like this, you go ahead, you set a few things, and then you leave and it's all set up for you. But you do have to click this Create Default. And now we see Nikon D850 camera settings sitting right there. So now let's go ahead and close this. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to re-import those photos. So if you remember, I had, with the exception of the Alabama Hills one, I had those identified as both camera settings and Adobe defaults. So now I'm going to go and just select the camera settings one. It's the exact same photo. I just made 2 copies of each and just named them differently. So back to File, Import Photo and Video. And now, and this time, because I had don't import suspected duplicates, it's going to make life a lot easier for me. I'm going to just go ahead and pull those 3 in, and let's look at the difference when we do that. Let's do a quick compare and contrast. So now with the camera settings being applied as opposed to the Adobe default, notice that we have things a lot cleaner. Let's actually go to this view. And let me just drag this photo up and zoom in and get to about the same spot. So this is the same bird that we have. So a lot cleaner, maybe not quite as sharp, but we can probably fix that up. And in fact, if we look at the difference in the defaults with what came in, sharpening on the one that had the camera settings was way down at 7. So if we change that, that comes. But notice how much cleaner this photo is. And we can probably do some other things to recover some of those details as well. So definitely much happier with this one, especially, again, very underexposed shot. Also notice that it did apply quite a bit of noise reduction, and we could probably even play with that a little bit, just bringing that down slightly to add a little bit of detail in. Probably didn't have to go quite as far as what it did. Now let's look at another example, and these are the flowers, and I'm going to do the same thing, bring the noisy one up over here, and notice again just how cleaner the one with the camera settings is. Now, did it go perhaps a little bit too far? Could be, but you know, we can definitely go ahead and get that looking very, very nice. Finally, let's take a look at the otter photo that was taken with the Canon. And here too, we notice that there is a little bit of a difference. It's not as big of a difference, but some of that could be because this image wasn't quite as noisy as what we saw with the other files. But there definitely was a difference. One thing that I did notice with the Canon is that it did not apply any additional noise reduction. So most likely what happened is with the interpretation of the raw file, there was probably something that took place in there, because this definitely is a little bit cleaner, especially when you look at the fur towards the back. You'll notice there's just a little bit less. Those are the 3 photos with a before and after comparison with doing the import. I will now show you the final versions of the 3 photos after I did all of the editing and that. and here they are. So I actually gave you 4 photos instead of 3. So I decided to also show the final edit for the Alabama Hills night photo as well. So just to summarize some of the things that I do to just reduce noise with my photos. First thing is I just make sure that I'm shooting brighter, and that may mean actually bringing the ISO up higher. That may be something that seems a little intimidating at first, but definitely worth doing. You could always take the photo 2 different ways and look at the difference, but I think you'll be pretty happy by doing that. Second thing is to have Lightroom set up to apply the camera settings on import. As you saw in the side-by-side comparisons, that makes a huge difference in the cleanness of the image that you're starting with. The third thing is avoid the desire to take the shadow slider and move it too far to the right. That is probably the thing I've noticed that causes the most noise in a photo when you're editing. It's actually better to take the exposure slider and move that to the right and then bring the whites down. Not quite sure why that seems to work a little bit better, makes things a little bit cleaner, but it certainly does, in my experience, make a big difference. And then finally, make use of the masking tools within Lightroom to do a lot of localized edits, and especially for things like sky background and that, things that are out of focus, to also just apply a lot of noise reduction within those masks that will also go a long way towards cleaning it up. And as a kind of a final thing, because I know people will ask, well, what about tools like the Denoise AI, the Topaz Photo AI, there's a bunch of others, and those definitely help as well. I usually do those as a final step. I know some of the software recommends you do it first. I think even Lightroom says to do it first, but I actually prefer to do it at the end. You could always back up in the history if there's a spot that you want to go back to and apply it at that point. Of course, you lose everything from that point on in terms of the history, but definitely something to kind of think about. So hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you found it informative and interesting. Nothing else, you see how I approach high ISO processing. If you did like it, please give it a like. If you would like to see more, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Thanks.